Have you ever agreed to something you didn't want to do? Not because someone forced you, not because you believed it was right, but because you felt bad saying no. Maybe it was a friend who said, "I thought you cared." Maybe it was a family member who went quiet after you refused, or someone who reminded you of everything they've done for you. You didn't change your decision because it made sense. You changed it because the discomfort was unbearable. That heaviness in your chest, that pressure in your mind, that quiet voice saying, "If I don't do this, I'm a bad person." That feeling has a name. It's guilt, and when guilt is used intentionally, it becomes one of the most powerful and invisible forms of manipulation. Today, we are not talking about hatred. We are not talking about revenge. We are talking about awareness, because once you understand how people manipulate you using guilt, you stop blaming yourself for pressure that was never yours to carry. What guilt actually is psychology, not morality. Most people grow up believing that guilt is a sign of goodness. You feel guilty because you care. You feel guilty because you have values. You feel guilty because you don't want to hurt others. And in a healthy form, guilt can be useful. But psychologically, guilt is not just a moral signal. It is a self-punishing emotion. Unlike anger, which points outward, or sadness, which asks for comfort, guilt points inward. It asks, "What's wrong with me? Why am I like this? Why did I disappoint them?" Notice something important. Guilt does not evaluate the situation objectively. It evaluates you. That is why guilt is so dangerous in the wrong hands. Because when someone triggers guilt in you, they don't need to argue, explain, or prove anything. Your own mind starts doing the work for them. Why guilt is the perfect tool for manipulation. Manipulation works best when it feels like your own choice. If someone threatens you, you resist. If someone pressures you aggressively, you become defensive. But guilt doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like responsibility. It convinces you that their feelings are your job, their disappointment is your failure, their pain is something you caused, and once you accept that belief, control becomes effortless. The manipulator doesn't have to demand. They just have to react emotionally. Your guilt fills in the rest. Healthy. Guilt versus weaponized guilt. Critical difference. This distinction is important. Because manipulators survive on confusion. Healthy guilt comes from clear wrongdoing, broken promises, harm you knowingly cause. It pushes you to fix, apologize, and grow. Weaponized guilt comes from you setting boundaries, you choosing yourself, you saying no to something unreasonable, you not meeting someone else's expectations. Weaponized guilt is not about correcting behavior. It is about maintaining control. If guilt appears every time you protect yourself, that guilt is not healthy. It is programmed. Why good people feel guilty so easily? Manipulators do not target people randomly. They look for specific emotional traits. They target people who are empathetic, are emotionally intelligent, hate conflict, want to be seen as kind, measure self-worth through usefulness. You are someone who feels others' emotions deeply. Guilt hits you harder, not because you are weak, but because your emotional system is open. Manipulators exploit this openness by turning your empathy inward. Against you, they make you feel cruel for protecting yourself and virtuous for overextending. Over time, you stop asking whether something is fair. You only ask whether it will upset someone. How guilt slowly becomes part of your identity. This is where guilt-based manipulation becomes truly damaging. At first, it's about small things. Helping when you're tired, agreeing when you're uncomfortable, staying silent, to keep peace, but slowly, guilt stops being a reaction. It becomes a rule. You begin to believe. A good person always sacrifices if I say no. I'm selfish if someone is hurt. It must be my fault. You don't just feel guilty. You identify as someone who should feel guilty. Your needs feel like burdens. Your boundaries feel like betrayals. And because this happens gradually, you don't notice the shift. You just feel more exhausted, more anxious, and more responsible for everyone but yourself. Why guilt feels moral, not manipulative. One reason guilt manipulation is so hard to detect is because it disguises itself as morality. It sounds like family comes first. If you cared, you would understand love means sacrifice. These ideas are not wrong on their own, but manipulators remove balance from them. They turn values into weapons suddenly. Sacrifice has no limit. Understanding only flows one way. Your feelings matter less than their comfort, and because these messages are wrapped in good intentions, you don't question them. You question yourself instead. The silent emotional contract you never agreed to at some point. Guilt manipulation creates an unspoken agreement in your mind. I am responsible for how others feel. Once this belief takes root, control is automatic. The other person doesn't need to ask. They don't need to explain. A sigh, a pause, a disappointed look, and your guilt activates. You fix things before they even complain. You apologize when you did nothing wrong. You adjust yourself to keep emotional peace, and slowly you disappear from your own decisions. Why guilt-based manipulation is so exhausting. Fear burns fast. Anger explodes, but guilt drains. It keeps you constantly monitoring your tone, your choices, your reactions. You become emotionally hyperaware, not of yourself, but of others. And the more you give, the more guilt demands. Because guilt has no finish line. No matter how much you sacrifice, it always asks for more. The most dangerous part of all, the most dangerous part of guilt manipulation is this: you don't feel controlled. You feel responsible. You don't think, they are manipulating me. You think, why am I like this? Why can't I be better? Why do I always disappoint people? That's how guilt keeps you trapped, by turning control into self-blame. That's how guilt keeps you trapped, by turning control into self-blame. Once guilt has taken root inside you, it doesn't need to shout to survive. It grows quietly through patterns that feel normal, familiar, even loving. Most people imagine manipulation as something obvious, but guilt-based manipulation is subtle by design. It works not by force, but by repetition. Not by arguments, but by emotional cues that train your mind over time. Guilt is not dropped into you all at once. It is planted, layer by layer. The first seed, emotional association. The earliest stage of guilt manipulation is emotional association. This is when a person begins linking their emotional state to your behavior. Even when the connection is unfair or exaggerated. They might feel sad when you say no. They might act distant when you prioritize yourself. They might become quiet, cold, or disappointed without directly saying why. Nothing is stated clearly. There is no accusation. But your brain notices the pattern. You start associating your independence with their sadness, your boundaries with their withdrawal, your honesty with emotional tension over time. Your mind learns a simple rule. When I choose myself, something bad happens emotionally. And because humans are wired to avoid emotional discomfort, you begin adjusting your behavior automatically. This is how guilt begins forming, not as a thought, but as a conditioned response. How silence becomes a weapon. One of the most powerful tools in guilt manipulation is silence. Silence is effective because it forces your mind to fill in the gaps. When someone stops talking, becomes distant, or emotionally unavailable after you assert yourself, your brain immediately searches for a reason. And because guilt already points inward, the conclusion is almost always, I did something wrong. Silence creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates anxiety. Anxiety looks for relief. The fastest way to relieve that discomfort is to give in, apologize, or reverse your decision, even if the other person never asked you to. This is not accidental. Silence trains you to self-correct. The language of implied blame. Guilt manipulation rarely uses direct blame. Instead, it relies on implication. Phrases like, I didn't expect this from you. I guess I'll just handle it myself. I thought you understood me. These statements do not accuse you explicitly. They simply suggest that you failed some invisible standard. And because the standard is never clearly defined, you can never fully meet it. Your mind keeps replaying the interaction, searching for what you did wrong. The manipulator doesn't need to explain. Your guilt keeps the loop running, creating emotional debt. Another common method of planting guilt is through emotional debt. This happens when someone repeatedly reminds you, directly or indirectly, of what they've done for you, not in a neutral way, but in a way that creates obligation. Examples include bringing up past sacrifices during disagreements, highlighting their effort when you hesitate to comply, framing favors as proof of loyalty or love over time. Your mind internalizes a belief, I owe them. And debt, emotional or financial, creates pressure to repay. The problem is that emotional debt in manipulative dynamics has no clear end. No matter how much you give back, the balance never feels settled. Guilt thrives in this imbalance. How repetition rewrites your internal voice. The most dangerous aspect of guilt manipulation is that eventually, the manipulator doesn't need to be present. After enough repetition, their voice becomes your inner voice. You start anticipating their disappointment before it happens. You imagine their reaction before making decisions. You censor yourself to avoid future guilt. This is how external control becomes internalized. At this stage, guilt no longer feels like something someone is doing to you. It feels like who you are. You say things like, I just feel bad for no reason. I overthink too much. I'm too sensitive. But the sensitivity didn't come from nowhere. It was trained. Why guilt is reinforced through small moments. Guilt manipulation doesn't rely on dramatic conflicts. It relies on everyday moments. A sigh when you decline. A change in tone. A delayed reply. A subtle comparison to someone more helpful or understanding. These moments seem insignificant on their own, but repeated over time, they create emotional conditioning. Your nervous system starts reacting before your rational mind can intervene. You feel guilt before you even know why, and because the trigger feels automatic, you assume the guilt must be justified. The role of praise in guilt manipulation. Manipulators don't only use negativity, they also use selective praise. You are praised when you comply. You are valued when you sacrifice. You are appreciated when you put yourself last. This creates a reward system where guilt becomes the price of approval. Your brain begins associating worth with self-approval with exhaustion, love with obligation, and because humans crave validation, You unconsciously repeat the behaviors that earn it, even when they harm you. How guilt blurs emotional responsibility, a crucial part of guilt. Manipulation is blurring responsibility. Healthy emotional boundaries recognize that you are responsible for your actions, others are responsible for their emotions. Manipulation disrupts this boundary. You are made to feel responsible for someone's mood, someone's stress, someone's disappointment, even when those emotions come from their own expectations or insecurities. Once responsibility is blurred, guilt becomes constant. Because you cannot control how others feel, you will always fall short. Why guilt feels like love. One reason guilt manipulation lasts so long is because it feels like caring. You tell yourself, I just don't want to hurt them. I care too much. This is what love looks like. But love does not require care does not require constant guilt. When guilt becomes the primary motivator in a relationship, connection slowly turns into control. The turning point you often miss there is usually a moment, small but significant, where guilt shifts from occasional to constant. It might be the first time you apologize without knowing why, or the first time you agree while feeling resentment, or the first time you silence yourself to avoid emotional fallout. That moment often goes unnoticed, but it marks the beginning of a pattern. From that point on, guilt stops reacting to actions. It starts anticipating them. Why you don't notice it happening? Guilt manipulation works because it feels gradual and familiar. There is no clear moment where you can say, this is manipulation. There is only a slow accumulation of emotional pressure. And because guilt aligns with values like kindness and empathy, it doesn't trigger alarm bells. It feels virtuous. You don't feel controlled. You feel considerate. The cost of internalized guilt as guilt becomes internalized. The cost increases. You feel constant emotional fatigue, difficulty making decisions, anxiety around boundaries, fear of disappointing others. But because guilt frames these feelings as personal flaws, you blame yourself instead of questioning the pattern. This is exactly how guilt maintains control, by hiding its source. This is exactly how guilt maintains control, by hiding its source. Once guilt has been planted and reinforced, it doesn't remain a feeling you experience occasionally. It becomes a decision-making system. At this stage, guilt is no longer just emotional pressure. It is the filter through which you evaluate every choice you make. You may believe you are acting freely, but your freedom is already compromised. You don't notice the moment control begins, because it doesn't arrive as force. It arrives as hesitation. How guilt replaces your inner authority before guilt takes control. Your decisions are guided by your needs, limits, and values. You consider what you want, what feels right, and what is reasonable. But once guilt becomes dominant, something shifts quietly. You stop asking, is this good for me? Do I have the capacity for this? Is this fair? Instead, you start asking, will they feel hurt? Will they be disappointed? Will they think I'm selfish? This shift is subtle but critical. Your inner authority is replaced by imagined emotional reactions. You are no longer deciding, you are predicting. And guilt rewards you for predicting others correctly by temporarily easing the emotional pressure. Why saying no starts feeling dangerous? One of the clearest signs that guilt is controlling you is how your body reacts to the idea of saying no, even before you speak. You feel tightness in your chest, a rush of anxiety, the urge to explain yourself excessively. You may rehearse your refusal again and again, trying to soften it, justify it, or make it sound less hurtful. Sometimes, you don't say no at all, you delay, avoid, or silently agree. This reaction is not because saying no is wrong. It's because guilt has trained your nervous system to associate refusal with emotional danger. You are not afraid of conflict. You are afraid of being responsible for someone else's feelings. How guilt turns choice into obligation. Guilt doesn't remove your ability to choose. It makes one option feel morally unacceptable. On the surface, you still have a choice. But internally, the cost of choosing yourself feels too high. You tell yourself, I could say no, but then I'd feel terrible. I could do what I want, but it would hurt them. It's easier to just go along with it. This is how guilt transforms voluntary actions into obligations. You stop giving because you want to. You give because not giving feels wrong. And once obligation replaces choice, resentment quietly begins to grow. The cycle of compliance and resentment tool-based control often traps people in a painful cycle. First, guilt pressures you to comply. Then, compliance drains you emotionally. Then, resentment builds quietly beneath the surface. But instead of expressing that resentment, guilt turns it inward. You think, why am I so irritated? Why can't I just be more patient? What's wrong with me? So you suppress the resentment and comply again. This cycle repeats until exhaustion becomes your baseline. Why? Guilt makes you over-explain. Guilt controls your decisions. Clarity feels cruel. Simplicity feels heartless. So, instead of saying, I can't do that, you say, I'm really sorry. I just have a lot going on, and I didn't sleep well. And I feel bad even saying this, but I hope you understand. Over-explaining is not communication. It is guilt trying to earn permission to exist. You feel the need to justify your boundaries because guilt tells you that your needs alone are not enough. How guilt controls time and energy. One of the most overlooked effects of guilt is how it controls your time. You may notice that your schedule is shaped by others' expectations, your rest is interrupted by obligation, your priorities are constantly rearranged. You don't choose how your energy is spent. Guilt chooses for you. And because guilt disguises itself as responsibility, you rarely question why you are always tired. The loss of spontaneity as guilt tightens its grip. Spontaneity disappears. You hesitate before expressing opinions. You calculate responses instead of speaking naturally. You censor your emotions to avoid triggering disappointment. Life becomes a series of emotional negotiations. This constant self-monitoring is exhausting, but it feels necessary, because guilt convinces you that emotional harmony depends entirely on you. Why guilt makes you doubt your feelings. Way guilt controls decisions is by invalidating your emotions. If you feel uncomfortable, guilt asks, are you overreacting? If you feel angry, guilt says, they didn't mean it. If you feel hurt, guilt whispers, you're too sensitive. Over time, you stop trusting your emotional signals. You defer to others' interpretations of events. This makes decision-making even harder, because you no longer believe your reactions are reliable. How guilt encourages self-abandonment, its core. Guilt-based control teaches you to abandon yourself. You ignore your limits. You minimize your needs. You postpone your desires indefinitely. And because this abandonment happens gradually, you don't recognize it as loss. You see it as maturity, kindness, or sacrifice. But sacrificing yourself repeatedly does not make you stronger. It makes you invisible. The illusion of being needy. Guilt often disguises control as being needed. You may feel valued because others rely on you emotionally. You become the problem solver, the listener, the dependable one. But reliance created through guilt is not appreciation. It is dependency. Your worth becomes tied to what you provide, not who you are, and the moment you try to step back, guilt rushes in to remind you of your role. Why guilt makes you fear change even when you recognize that something is wrong. Guilt makes change feel threatening. You worry, what if they can't handle it? What if I hurt them? What if I'm the bad one? So you stay, not because it feels right, but because leaving or changing feels worse. Guilt convinces you that stability matters more than well-being. Quiet disappearance of desire. One of the final stages of guilt-based control is emotional numbness. When every desire comes with guilt, wanting starts to feel pointless. So you stop wanting. You focus on managing emotions, not experiencing life. This is not peace. It is resignation. Why guilt feels like your own voice by this stage. Guilt no longer feels external. It sounds like your thoughts. It feels like your conscience. It appears logical and reasonable. This is why guilt-based control is so hard to escape. You are not fighting another person. You are fighting a belief system that is merged with your identity. The cost you pay without realizing the cost of guilt-controlled decisions is not immediate. It accumulates. You lose confidence in your judgment, connection with your needs, energy for growth and joy. But because guilt frames this loss as virtue, you accept it silently. But because guilt frames this loss as virtue, you accept it silently. This is the reason guilt-based manipulation survives for so long. It does not announce itself as control. It disguises itself as morality, responsibility, love, and maturity. By the time you sense something is wrong, guilt has already rewritten the meaning of right and wrong inside you. Guilt hides behind good intentions. Most forms of manipulation trigger suspicion because they feel aggressive or unfair. Guilt does the opposite. It presents itself as care. You are told, directly or indirectly, that thinking of others is kindness, sacrifice is love, endurance is strength. And none of these ideas are inherently false. But guilt manipulation removes balance from them. When caring has no limits, it becomes self-neglect. When sacrifice has no consent, it becomes control. When endurance replaces choice, it becomes emotional imprisonment. Yet because these concepts are socially praised, you rarely question them. Why guilt feels moral. Not controlling guilt feels moral because it is tied to your values. You don't feel guilty about things you don't care about. You feel guilty where your identity is invested. Kindness, loyalty, empathy, responsibility. Manipulators understand this. They don't attack your values. They use them. They frame their expectations as tests of your goodness. If you comply, you feel virtuous. If you resist, you feel selfish. This moral framing prevents you from asking whether the situation is fair. You are too busy evaluating your character. How social conditioning protects guilt manipulation from a young age. Many people are taught that saying no is rude. Prioritizing yourself is selfish. Good people put others first. These lessons are often given with good intentions, but when absorbed without nuance, they create fertile ground for guilt-based control. Guilt manipulation thrives in environments where boundaries are discouraged, emotional expression is uneven, harmony is valued over honesty. In these contexts, guilt feels normal. Resistance feels wrong. The role of praise and shame. Guilt manipulation is reinforced through a simple system: reward and withdrawal. When you comply, you receive warmth, approval, relief from tension. When you resist, you experience coldness, disappointment, emotional distance. This pattern trains your nervous system more effectively than logic ever could. You don't need to be told what to do. You learn what behavior keeps emotional safety intact. Why? You defend the people who guilt you. One of the most confusing aspects of guilt manipulation is that people often defend the very individuals who control them. You may think they mean well, they've been through a lot, they're just sensitive. This defense is not irrational. It is a survival strategy. Acknowledging manipulation would mean confronting loss, imbalance, and possibly betrayal. Guilt encourages you to protect the relationship, even at your own expense. How guilt creates self-doubt. Instead of clarity, healthy relationships produce clarity. Manipulative guilt produces confusion. Instead of feeling angry or certain, you feel unsure, torn, in conflict with yourself. You replay conversations repeatedly. You analyze tone, wording, timing. This confusion keeps you stuck, because guilt thrives where certainty is absent. Why guilt rarely triggers anger. Anger is a boundary emotion. It signals violation. Guilt suppresses anger by redirecting it inward. Instead of thinking, they crossed a line. You think, I shouldn't feel this way. This redirection prevents confrontation and protects the manipulative dynamic. The illusion of choice. Guilt manipulation maintains the illusion of choice. Technically, you are free to say no. Emotionally, the cost feels unbearable. This illusion keeps you from recognizing control. Because nothing is forced explicitly, you comply voluntarily. Under pressure, you don't fully see why guilt is strongest in close relationships. Manipulation is most effective where emotional bonds already exist. In friendships, family, and intimate relationships, trust lowers your defenses. You expect care, not control. This makes subtle manipulation harder to detect, because it feels inconsistent with the image you hold of the other person. You question yourself before questioning them. How guilt uses time against youth. Longer guilt-based patterns persist, the harder they are to see. You normalize exhaustion. You adapt to imbalance. You lower expectations. What once felt wrong begins to feel familiar, and familiarity often masquerades as normalcy. While you blame yourself for not coping better when guilt manipulation takes hold, failure is framed as personal weakness. You think, I should be stronger. I should handle this better. Why is this so hard for me? You don't realize that the difficulty is the result of sustained emotional pressure, not a flaw in your character. The moral trap. Guilt manipulation traps you in a moral dilemma where both options feel wrong. If you comply, you lose yourself. If you resist, you feel cruel. This trap keeps you immobilized, because guilt convinces you that your discomfort is the price of being good. Why? Awareness feels threatening at first. Recognizing guilt manipulation often brings discomfort, not relief. You may feel sadness for time lost, anger, you suppressed, fear of change. Guilt resists awareness because awareness threatens its control. It tells you, don't overthink, don't be unfair, don't make things worse. These thoughts are not truth. They are protection mechanisms for the pattern. The moment guilt begins to lose power, guilt starts losing power the moment you question its source, not by fighting it, not by rejecting it, but by asking, is this truly my responsibility? This question weakens guilt's authority, because guilt relies on unquestioned assumption. That is where part 5 continues, with reclaiming your emotional autonomy and rebuilding boundaries that protect both your empathy and your self-respect. Breaking free from guilt-based manipulation does not mean becoming cold, distant, or uncaring. That belief itself is one of guilt's last defenses. True freedom is not the absence of empathy. It is the return of choice. Guilt loses power, not when you stop caring, but when you stop confusing care with self-erasure. The first shift. Separating responsibility from emotion, the foundation of freedom begins with one clear distinction. You are responsible for your actions. You are not responsible for other people's emotions. This does not mean ignoring how others feel. It means recognizing where your responsibility ends. Someone can feel disappointed without you being wrong. Someone can feel upset without you being guilty. Someone can feel uncomfortable without you needing to fix it. Guilt collapses responsibility and emotion into one. Freedom separates them. Why you must allow discomfort. One of the hardest steps in breaking free from guilt is allowing others to feel discomfort. Guilt manipulation trains you to believe that discomfort is dangerous, that it must be avoided at all costs. But discomfort is not harm. It is part of emotional reality. When you stop rushing to relieve others' discomfort, you interrupt the guilt cycle. At first, this feels wrong. Your body may react with anxiety. Your mind may search for excuses to give in. This reaction is not a sign you are doing something bad. It is a sign you are doing something new. Learning to pause instead of react. Guilt thrives on immediacy. It pushes you to respond quickly, apologize quickly, comply quickly. One of the most effective ways to weaken guilt is to pause, not to argue, not to explain, just to pause. A pause gives you space to ask, what am I feeling? What is being asked of me? Is this reasonable for me right now? That pause breaks guilt's automatic control. Why you don't need to justify your boundaries. Boundaries do not require permission. Guilt tells you that boundaries must be justified, softened, and explained until everyone feels okay. But boundaries are not negotiations about your worth. You can say, I can't do that. I'm not available. That doesn't work for me. And stop. There, the urge to over-explain is guilt, trying to regain control, letting go of the need to be understood. Of guilt's strongest hooks is the need to be understood. You may feel desperate for the other person to get it, to see your side, to agree that your boundary is reasonable, but understanding is not always available, especially in manipulative dynamics. Freedom comes when you realize you do not need to be understood to be allowed. Reclaiming your inner authority, breaking free from guilt, means returning decision-making power to yourself. This involves asking different questions. What do I want? What do I need? What is sustainable for me? At first, these questions may feel unfamiliar. Guilt may label them selfish, but self-reference is not selfishness. It is self-respect. Expect resistance, internally and externally, when you change guilt-based patterns. Resistance is normal. Others may act confused, push back emotionally, increase guilt temporarily, or own mind may doubt, minimize, romanticize the past. This does not mean you are wrong. It means the system is losing stability. Why guilt gets louder before it gets weaker. Guilt often intensifies when you stop obeying it. You may feel stronger waves of discomfort at first. This is not regression. It is withdrawal. Guilt loses power through non-engagement, not confrontation. You don't argue with it. You don't prove it wrong. You let it exist without obeying it. Redefining. Kindness, true kindness, does not require self-betrayal. You can be kind and still say no. You can be empathetic and still choose yourself. You can care without carrying what is not yours. When kindness includes you, guilt has no place to hide. The difference between empathy and enmeshment tempi allows connection. Enmeshment erases boundaries. Guilt manipulation thrives in enmeshment, where emotions blur and responsibilities mix. Healthy empathy says, I see your feelings. Guilt-based enmeshment says, I must fix your feelings. Learning this difference restores emotional balance. Rebuilding trust in your feeling damages your trust in your own emotional signals. Breaking free means slowly relearning to listen to discomfort, fatigue, resistance. These signals are not flaws. They are information. You don't need to justify them to honor them. Why you may feel lonely at first when guilt no longer controls you. Dynamics change. Some connections deepen. Others fade. This can feel lonely, but loneliness is not failure. It is transition. You are making space for relationships that respect choice instead of obligation. The quiet return of energy as guilt loosens its grip. Something subtle happens. You feel lighter. Decisions feel simpler. Your energy returns, not because life is easier, but because it is no longer constantly negotiated. What freedom actually feels like freedom from guilt is not loud or dramatic. It feels like calm after saying no, relief without explanation, presence without performance. It feels like being yourself without rehearsal. Guilt was never proof that you were good. It was proof that you were trained to carry more than your share. Awareness does not make you selfish. It makes you honest. And honesty is where real connection with others and yourself finally begins.